All right, Alexander, let's talk about the mineral deal, the rare earth mineral deal, but it's actually a mineral resources deal, if you can even call it a deal. But it covers rare earth, okay, but it also covers oil, gas, and logistics, ports. So, I mean, it's pretty much covering all of Ukraine's resources. And so we're most likely going to get a signature from Zelensky. He wants to do it in Trump's presence, and Trump is saying that this mineral deal is going to be good for Ukraine. No security guarantees, but it provides security in the fact that, according to Trump, according to his statements, the fact that U.S. Business will be in Ukraine, and no one's going to mess with Ukraine if U.S. investment and business is in Ukraine. So that's the security guarantee that's implied in this arrangement. So what are your thoughts with this rare earth minerals deal, which is actually minerals and resources and just about everything in Ukraine? It's a terrible deal. They took off, I mean, they amended it. They took off the 500 billion cap, all of that stuff. But it's a terrible deal. But it looks like it's going to be signed unless something happens. Anyway, what are your thoughts?
Well, the first thing to say is that it is the most bizarre, the most extraordinary document in terms I have ever seen. We will come to that shortly. I'd like to just say a few things because I've read many treaties in my time. Worked through many commercial contracts. I've seen all sorts of things of this kind. I've never seen anything like this deal in my life. That's the first thing. This document, maybe I should say, in my life. But there's one thing I really do want to address first, which is that a lot of the narrative that we've been hearing over the last couple of days is that this document is actually better for Ukraine than the document that was presented to Ukraine by Vance and Rubio to Zelensky at the Munich Security Conference, and which Scott Bassent had tried to get Zelensky to agree to when he went to Kiev. Now, I actually think this is completely untrue. I think this is much worse. If I was, an economic advisor to Zelensky, I would say this deal is far worse than the previous one. All right, I mean, you're going to set up a fund, and according to the previous deal, the United States would own it 100%, and now it's only going to own 50%. But this $500 billion cap that people were talking about was at least a cap. It meant that, once the United States got its $500 billion, presumably it would have walked away and this arrangement would have ended and Ukraine would have been able to move forward and sort out its own, future as it wanted. And maybe if you'd sort of wanted to negotiate about that, you could have reduced it, you could have found some way around it and all that, or something of that kind. Now that cap has been removed. So far as I could tell, reading this document, this arrangement is going to continue indefinitely. So forever, in perpetuity, Ukraine is supposed to give 50% of the profits from exploitation of its resources to the United States. I mean, there is no end point when this apparently stops. So how people could see this as a better deal than the one that was offered to Zelensky before, I am completely unable to see. That is my first point. The second point is that this isn't, in any conceivable sense, even a workable deal. I mean, usually when agreements of this kind, when countries move towards agreements of this kind, when that happens, firstly, you get some kind of statement of agreement, points of agreement. The United States and Ukraine want to work together to develop Ukraine's resources. So there's points of agreement about that. Then there's all kinds of contracts agreed that there is proper debate about how mechanisms are going to be set up. There's pricing formulas. There's a list of the resources that are actually going to be exploited and what they are and what their presumed value is. There's nothing of that here. There's absolutely nothing. It's just incredibly vague. It appears on its face to give the United States the right to anything it wants anywhere in Ukraine. As I said, basically in perpetuity. Manufacturing isn't covered. But then what manufacturing does Ukraine realistically have now? So, I mean, the whole thing is just incredible. So ports, logistics, the United States is being given a perpetual lien over everything that Ukraine has. And within this agreement, there are all sorts of political provisions which would have no place usually in an agreement of this economic nature. So we have a statement that Ukraine, gave away its nuclear weapons back in whenever it was in the 90s. We've already discussed this many times. That clearly was inserted at Zelensky's insistence. It's completely irrelevant to an economic deal of this nature. And we have this reference to United States supporting Ukraine in obtaining security guarantees, which of course ultimately means that the United States is not going to give Ukraine security guarantees, because why would it support Ukraine in getting security guarantees from itself? I mean, that is illogical. Other people are supposed to give Ukraine the security guarantees. But why is that even there? I mean, usually you would have this. If there was any question of security guarantees, it would be in a completely separate document. And since we're talking about security guarantees, if the United States were indeed giving security guarantees in a document to Ukraine, an actual security guarantee, that would elevate this to a treaty. And that kind of treaty would have to be ratified by the Senate, because it would make a military commitment to Ukraine on behalf of the United States. This apparently is not going to be put to the Senate. And the Ukrainians themselves are telling us it's not going to even be ratified by the Ukrainian parliament. So, I mean, this is the weirdest, most bizarre document I had ever seen in my life. Basically, what it is doing is Zelensky's giving Ukraine away to the Americans for nothing. He's getting nothing back. Whether the Americans will get anything out of it, of course, is a completely different matter, because this is so vague and difficult to understand. And as I said, none of the institutions that have been set out there, this fund, who's going to operate this fund? Where's it going to be based? It's going to be based in Kiev, in Washington, where is it? But whatever. But on its face, as I said, this gives the whole of Ukraine, half of its resources in perpetuity to the United States in return for nothing.
Yeah, the agreement's published now. I just want to tell everybody that if you want to find the agreement in full, you can now find it on the internet. Before, the information we were working off of was information from Financial Times or Bloomberg or New York Times. But now the actual agreement has been published. I've had employment contracts that are longer than this agreement.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, really, I've had employment contracts that are longer than this thing. The terms and conditions on websites are longer and more detailed than this agreement, if you can even call it an agreement. So to be fair to some of the statements that have been made by U.S. officials and Ukraine officials from the reporting of the New York Times and Bloomberg, they do tell these outlets that they will negotiate many of the details in the future. That's what they say. Okay, whatever. Maybe they will. Maybe they will negotiate all the details in the future. But this document is very, very sparse, very, very short, sparse, very not detailed at all.
No.
And it's just basically a piece of paper which says, take our oil, gas, and minerals. Here you go.
Well,
Here you go.
That is exactly. That is
Take
exactly.
it and put it in a fund. That's the thing. Just put it in some fund.
Yeah.
Some fund, and we'll see how everything works out.
Exactly.
Okay, answer that, and then also answer the question: why then?
Yeah.
What's the purpose of this then?
Well, exactly. I mean, on its face, this thing is unworkable, and logically, if there are going to be further agreements behind this, which would be presumably the real agreements, in any rational world, those would take years to negotiate. I mean, this kind of relationship,
giving away your country.
But I mean, even then, I mean, you would need. Because bear in mind, property rights of all kinds of people presumably are going to be involved. As I said, you're going to be looking at pricing formulas. You're going to be looking at all kinds of things. But if this is done properly, once the lawyers get to it, I mean, you would have agreements that are thousands upon thousands of pages long, and which would take an enormously long time to negotiate. I mean, probably years. And I think that's an exaggeration. So why do it? Well, I'm going to make a few quick observations. Firstly, whether Trump has thought this out, I am not absolutely sure. But this is a real blow to Europe because the Europeans are still talking about bringing Ukraine into the EU. What Ukraine? I mean, if this deal is put into place, if it's actually implemented in any kind of way, then the Ukrainian economy is basically mortgaged to the Americans. So the Americans would be a stakeholder, and they would presumably have a big role in any future negotiations with the EU about Ukraine's EU entry. I don't think anybody's thought about this. I've not seen this discussed in any place, but logically, that is the case. I mean, I've looked at EU documents. I've seen how they work. I mean, how is this in any way, for example, compatible with European law, with the acquis? I mean, it's unknown to me. So it might be, to some extent, it might have been intended a bit as a spoke in this. I don't know. But, what is the point of this? What is the point of this, as you absolutely rightly say, on its face, worthless piece of paper? Well, there is something about Ukraine at the moment that is causing people to come away with worthless pieces of paper. I mean, Starmer just did a 100-year treaty with Ukraine. Now we have this mineral deal with Ukraine, which isn't a deal or a contract or a treaty or any of those sort of things. But I suppose you could say that it gives each side something symbolic that they can show. So the Americans have now got Ukraine to acknowledge, and it is in the recitals, that the United States has invested a huge amount of money in Ukraine, and that Ukraine has some kind of obligation to return it. Zelensky talks about the fact that Ukraine has not incurred any debts, but basically that is how this document treats them. So that shows to the American people, that enables Trump to say, look, we're getting a return, or at least the Ukrainians are promising us a return on that. They're acknowledging that we have provided them that kind of help. And that does give the Americans perhaps more leverage over Ukraine going forward. That's the first thing. And for Zelensky, and I think this is the reason Zelensky is pushing this thing and why he first proposed this minerals thing in the first place, is that he's still hoping in some way to get the Americans to come in, invest in Ukraine, and then he's going to say, you must protect your investment, and that must mean that you're going to have to provide us at some point with some kind of security guarantees. So this is what this is all about. It's not really about extracting resources. at least not in the minds of those who signed it. So that might be its long-term effect, but it's more about that. I think, by the way, Zelensky here is profoundly wrong. The United States has invested heavily in many countries, in South Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and it has been prepared to walk away. These investments are never going to be realized. I mean, even if all of the contracts are agreed, if they're signed, if they're worked out properly, you still have to build a plant, create the factories, establish the mines, secure the peace, get Ukraine's infrastructure operating. That is a project of 10, 20 years before the United States would realistically start to see any of this money. So the Americans can absolutely walk away from this if they want to. That's the truth of it.
Yeah, rebuild the entire country of Ukraine. That's what the U.S. is going to do while ignoring the United States, maybe. I mean, but Trump ran on an America First policy, so I don't know how Americans are going to feel about this.
Well,
but I agree with you. They left $80 billion in weapons in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
They just walked away from it overnight.
Yeah.
Overnight, the base was there, and the next day, everything was shut down, and they were gone. Yeah. So I mean, if the United States wants to walk away from this, they can absolutely walk away from this. But I get back to the question: walk away from what?
No.
I mean, what are they walking away from? They own Ukraine now, or do they own Ukraine?
Well, they do own. I mean, according to this, effectively, they do own Ukraine. But I mean, in truth, this is a piece of paper. That is all it is.
So what is the purpose of this for Trump, or is there no purpose? Is this a distraction? Oh, by the way, no one talks about the fact that, I just want to say this, I always forget to mention this, no one talks about the fact that Ukraine has something like 35 security guarantees that they signed over the past couple of years with all these countries. They have all these security guarantees. I remember they were bragging about all these security guarantees. They had these big signing events.
Including one with Britain.
Yeah, Britain, Estonia, Lithuania, France, Canada, I even think the United States as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
They had a security guarantee signing with the United States and with Biden. I remember all of that.
Yeah.
I think that was the event where Biden called Zelensky Putin.
That's right.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, my point is, or my question is, what is the point to all of this? Is it a Trump distraction?
Yeah.
Is that the reason that we have this whole thing? Is it a way for Trump? Does he believe that he can take this document to the Russians and use it as leverage?
Yes.
And say, okay, well, now I own Ukraine. Now I have the oil and the gas, and now I have the port of Odessa. It's under my control. So let's deal. Or is this a way for Trump to take this document to the Russians and say, okay, now I own Ukraine. I have the oil and the gas in Odessa. Let's resolve this problem with the conflict, and let's do business together. I mean, does he want to use this for leverage and be tough in negotiations, or does he want to use this so that he can work together with the Russians? Or is this just all smoke and mirrors and just one big media marketing distraction?
I think mostly it is smoke and mirrors, but I also think, again, it's Donald Trump putting Zelensky in his place, which is, I think, an important thing. I mean, if you follow Trump, I mean, he likes this is very much his approach. He likes to establish psychological dominance over someone, and this is basically what he's doing with Zelensky. He's basically browbeaten Zelensky into signing this piece of paper, which basically hands over Ukraine to the United States. And that puts Zelensky in a weak position relative to Trump, which gives Trump leverage over Zelensky. It doesn't give Trump any leverage over the Russians. If he comes along to the Russians and waves this piece of paper to them. And by the way, the Russians know all about contracts. I mean, they negotiate massive contracts. I mean, I've seen some of the paperwork on Power of Siberia 1, for example, and I can tell you it's enormous. And I've seen some of the documents on Nord Stream, and some of which are publicly available. You can find them, by the way, and they are even more enormous. I mean, they are huge. If he comes along and shows the Russians in a negotiation this piece of paper and says, this means I own Ukraine, they'll just laugh at him. That's what they will do.
Well, the United States also knows must know contracts.
Absolutely, of course
Bassett knows contracts.
Of course they do.
Trump knows contracts. I mean,
Absolutely.
the U.S. They're the best at contracts. I mean,
they are the best at
the same
really
argument can be made for the U.S. So obviously they see this.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
what do they, I mean, they
Yes.
know this isn't
Yes.
the
Yes.
real deal. I mean,
Absolutely. So this is why I come back to what I said. I think this is basically Trump putting Zelensky in his place, showing to Zelensky, look, I'm not just supporting you, I own you. You can't ultimately go against me because you've had all of this money from me, and the Ukrainians have now acknowledged that, even though Zelensky whines on about how these were grants and not debts. And you've just signed this piece of paper handing over your country to me, which means that I don't just own your country, I also own you. So I think this is what this is all about. It's very tough, actually. You could even say it's cruel in some ways, but it does put Trump in a strong position relative to Zelensky, given that it is Zelensky who, as the Americans obviously by now know, is the major obstacle to any successful negotiation with the Russians.
I own you, and it puts the U.S. in a strong position to what ends? I think this is where this is the question. To what end? Okay, so now Trump says, I own you. I own the country. I own you. What's the end goal that Trump wants to get to?
The end goal, I'm absolutely convinced, is a deal with the Russians. I mean, he wants this deal to be negotiated by Ukraine rather than directly the United States. I mean,
but he owns Ukraine now.
But now he owns Ukraine. So that gives him, as I said, leverage over Zelensky. So if Zelensky says, I don't want to negotiate with the Russians, the Americans come along and say to him, you've got to negotiate with the Russians. You come to all these agreements where you've given us a lien, in effect, over all of your economy in order to protect this right that we have over your country, this ownership that we have over your country. You have to do what we want you to do, because if you don't, well, you're breaking your agreement with us, and there will be consequences.
Okay, my final question, what does the U.S. want out of the deal with Russia? Do you have any ideas? Because Trump did say some interesting things. He talked about how the U.S. is going to be on this land in Ukraine. I mentioned how he talked about U.S. businesses in Ukraine, and that means that the Russians will not mess with Ukraine. He talked about when he was asked by a reporter, he talked about getting some of the trying to get some of the territory back. Though he said it's going to be hard, but he did talk about trying to get some of the territory back for Ukraine. I mean, what is he says stuff which seems to pull away from Istanbul Plus. Let's just say that. So, I mean, it's a negotiation, so understood.
Absolutely.
But what does Trump want in a negotiation with Russia? Does he want a quick solution? Because a quick solution would be Istanbul Plus.
Yeah.
Or does he want a long negotiation? And does he want to try to actually do some of the things that he said during the cabinet meeting? That he does want to get some territory back, or that he does want to put U.S. businesses on the ground in Ukraine so that the Russian military can't do anything. I mean, U.S. businesses, U.S. people in Odessa. I think this would. I don't understand how the Russians would be able to accept such a thing, but I don't know.
At the moment, they wouldn't. And to be honest, I can't imagine U.S. businesses going to Odessa.
Well,
bear in mind.
I'm simplifying it. I'm simplifying it a lot.
Absolutely. But I mean, bear in mind, there's been all sorts of attempts to get European businesses to invest in Ukraine, and they're not doing so. So, I mean, American businesses are not going to go into Ukraine until the war is ended. So what I think Trump basically wants to do is he wants to do a deal with the Russians. He wants to end the war. He wants to normalize relations with the Russians. He wants to lift sanctions. I mean, he's made all that fairly clear by now. And ultimately, he wants to do a long-term deal with the Russians, which will mean that the Russians agree to the Americans having some kind of rights in whatever Ukraine is left. And, long-term economic rights, mineral rights, ports, and things of that kind in whatever Ukraine is left, and perhaps also having rights in the Arctic, in Russia itself, and that sort of thing. And the objective always is, I think, to put the United States in a better economic position. That's how Trump would say it, but also to draw the Russians to some extent away from China and to obtain uh, um, raw materials, minerals, um, special metals, some types of rare earths, of which China at the moment has the monopoly.
A final question. How does Russia feel about this, or how would Russia feel about this enriching the United States or coming to some sort of an agreement where the U.S. benefits from all of this, when at the end of the day, it was the United States that started all of this?
I think this is going to be a very, very hard sell in Moscow. I think some people in Moscow would probably go along with it. Perhaps Putin would. I think his investment chief, Kirill Dmitriev, who worked in Wall Street, by the way, probably would. But I think at a sort of more popular level, this wouldn't go down well at all. Just saying. So, and I don't think Putin, I think that, again, people underestimate this. I don't think Putin is going to trade this away very, very easily. I've come back to what I've been saying before in many places. You want to negotiate these kind of things with the Russians, by all means try, but they're very, very tough negotiators. And, if you want to go down this sort of route, they would almost certainly demand economic concessions, big economic concessions in return. And I don't just mean, concessions about lifting sanctions, but probably about rights for for Russia to trade in the United States and things of that kind. Things which the United States has never been prepared to concede up to now.
Why does the Trump administration keep on saying that they're very close to a deal? Even Levitt the other day said that they're very close to a deal, and both sides, Russia and Ukraine, are gonna leave the deal a little bit unhappy. I mean, why do they keep on going down this route? Ceasefire, close to a deal. Ceasefire, close to a deal. I mean, they keep on saying all this stuff, and Russia refutes this, but they keep on saying it.
Yes.
Is there something that we don't know?
Well, I think they're partly doing this in order to keep everybody off balance, to keep the Europeans off balance, because the Europeans are running around asking themselves, what are the Americans up to? Is this going faster and further than we know? Is keeping the Ukrainians very nervous and off balance too. And it's perhaps preventing opposition crystallizing to this policy within the United States itself. Because remember, Ukraine has its supporters in the United States. So you don't want to give them time to organize and oppose this. But of course, it doesn't work with one critical party, which is the Russians. The Russians have made it very clear that they're not going to be rushed or be rushed into any sort of agreements. They are sticking firmly by Istanbul Plus. They've restated all of that in several comments. And as I said before, talking about the fact that a deal is going to be made quickly is going to be seen in Moscow as a sign that Trump needs a deal, which gives Russia leverage over him.
All right. We will end the video there, the Duran.locals.com. We are on Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, Rockfin, and X. Go to the Duran shop, pick up some merch like what we are wearing in this video update. The link is in the description box down below. Take care.